The year is 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the most important album cover in the history of popular music. The Beatles assembled it themselves. 62 faces, the people who shaped them. Marilyn Monroe is there, Albert Einstein, Oscar Wilde, and Tony Curtis. Bernie Schwartz from the Bronx. Son of a Hungarian immigrant tailor. A kid who grew up so poor his family sometimes didn't eat. Elvis Presley copied his hair in 1953 and started a revolution. The Beatles put his face on the most famous album ever made. For one burning window in the late 1950s, he was the most famous movie star on the planet. Then, Hollywood forgot him. Not slowly, not kindly. The way Hollywood always forgets, by simply stopping to call. 144 films, 6 marriages, a drug habit that nearly killed him twice, a daughter who became more famous than he was, and a quote about Marilyn Monroe that followed him for 50 years, like a bad debt. This is Bernie Schwartz. Welcome to his story. Chapter 1. The Bronx. Bernard Schwartz was born on the 3rd of June 1925 in the Bronx, New York. The birth certificate said Bernard. The street said Bernie. Neither name would survive. His parents were Hungarian Jewish immigrants, Emanuel Schwartz, a tailor from Mitsaka in eastern Hungary, and Helen Klein, a woman whose mental illness would define the emotional weather of Bernie's childhood in ways he spent the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite managing to describe fully enough. Emanuel had come to America with the specific immigrant faith that the country rewarded effort with proportional return. He opened a tailor shop on Stanton Street on the Lower East Side and then moved the family to the Bronx as the business grew marginally more stable. The shop never quite generated enough. The family lived in a series of small apartments, 4 people, sometimes more, in 2 rooms. The particular compressed intimacy of poverty that leaves no space for privacy and no privacy for grief. Helen Schwartz was beautiful and deeply unwell. Her mental illness never formally diagnosed in the language available to working-class immigrant families in the 1930s, but described by Curtis in his 2008 autobiography, American Prince, as something that made her unpredictable, sometimes violent, and often entirely absent even when physically present, shaped the household around its demands. Bernie learned early to read the room, to gauge the temperature, to perform whatever version of himself was safest in the current moment. This skill, the ability to become what a situation required, would serve him enormously in Hollywood. It cost him considerably everywhere else. He had 2 brothers. Julius, born 1929, was gentle and close to Bernie in the specific way of children who have only each other as reliable constants. Robert, born 1934, died in infancy. And then Julius Julie died in 1933, struck by a truck on a Bronx street while Bernie watched. Bernie was 8 years old. He carried the image of his brother's death for the rest of his life. It appears in his autobiography with the directness of someone who has tried to process it for 70 years and has accepted that some things do not process. The poverty was not romantic. This needs to be said plainly because the Hollywood biography of Tony Curtis has a tendency to use the Bronx childhood as colour as the before picture that makes the after picture more dramatic. The poverty was cold and specific, and it left marks. The Schwartz family was on relief during the worst of the Depression. Bernie wore his father's cut-down suits to school. He stole food. He ran with street gangs, the East Side Boys, by his own account, not from romance, but from the practical calculus of a boy who understood that belonging to something was safer than belonging to nothing. He was also, from a young age, extraordinarily handsome. This is not vanity, it is a biographical fact with consequences. The face that would eventually be reproduced on 1,000 movie posters was already fully assembled in the Bronx, already producing the specific effect in rooms that very beautiful people produce, a slight shift in attention, a recalibration of who matters in the space. Bernie understood this effect before he had language for it, and he understood it as a resource in the way that people who have very few resources understand the ones they have. He discovered acting through the settlement houses and community centers that operated in his neighborhood institutions designed to give immigrant children access to the arts, to English, to the American cultural vocabulary that might eventually allow them to pass. At the Clinton Drama Club on DeWitt Clinton High School's stage, Bernie Schwartz found the thing that would organize his life. Not immediately, not with the clean narrative clarity of biographical hindsight, but he found it. The Second World War interrupted everything. Bernie enlisted in the United States Navy in 1942, at 17, lying about his age to get in. He served on the submarine tenderess Proteus in the Pacific, and the Navy gave him two things he had not previously had: discipline and distance from the Bronx. The distance was clarifying. The discipline was something he used for the rest of his professional life and could not apply to his personal one. He was discharged in 1945. He was 20 years old. He had no money, no degree, no plan beyond the one he had formed on the stage at DeWitt Clinton. He was going to be an actor. Not because it seemed likely. Because nothing else had ever felt like the right answer to who he was. He enrolled at the dramatic workshop of the New School in Manhattan, studying under Erwin Piscator, a German theatre director who had fled the Nazis and brought with him a rigorous European approach to performance that was entirely unlike anything Bernie had encountered at the Clinton Drama Club. He waited tables. He drove a grocery truck. He took every odd job available to someone whose only marketable skill was a face and a willingness to use it. Universal Pictures talent scouts found him in 1948 performing in a small production in Millbrook, New York. The scouts' report, by various accounts, focused almost entirely on the face. Universal signed him for $75 a week. Bernie Schwartz became Tony Curtis on a studio executive's say-so. The name was assembled from a list, Tony, from Anthony. Curtis from no particular source anyone could later verify. He accepted it because he had no mechanism to refuse it, and because he understood, with the cold practicality of a boy who had grown up poor in the Bronx, that Tony Curtis was going to get further than Bernie Schwartz. He was right. He was also, in accepting the name, beginning the long process of becoming someone the world would one day forget entirely how to see clearly. Chapter 2. The Hair. Before the films. Before Some Like It Hot. Before the Oscar nomination and the Hollywood parties and the marriages that made every front page in America, there was the hair. Tony Curtis arrived at Universal in 1948 with a face that the studio immediately understood, and a body they put to work in costume pictures and action films that asked very little beyond physical presence and the ability to hold a frame. He was good at both. He was also, from the beginning, intensely interested in his own image in a way the studio found useful and colleagues found occasionally exhausting. The hairstyle developed somewhere in the early 1950s, a pompadour at the front, swept back and high, with a distinctive curl that fell forward over the forehead. Curtis wore it with the specific confidence of someone who understands that their appearance is their primary currency and treats its management accordingly. He spent time on it. He cared about it publicly, without embarrassment, in an era when men were not supposed to visibly care about such things. The caring was itself a kind of statement. In 1953, a 19-year-old truck driver from Memphis named Elvis Presley walked into a movie theater and saw Tony Curtis on screen. This is documented. Elvis spoke about it in various interviews across his career, and the people around him in the early years confirmed it. He went home and styled his hair in the manner of what he had seen: the pompadour, the curl, the deliberate architecture of it. Elvis then put that hairstyle on the most famous face of the 20th century, and the hairstyle became the symbol of everything the establishment feared about what was happening to American youth: the sexuality, the rebellion, the rejection of the crew-cut conformity that post-war America had decided was the correct way for young men to present themselves. Tony Curtis never received a royalty on this. He did not expect one. What the Elvis connection gave him was something more durable than money. It made him a cultural originator rather than merely a movie star. His face and his hair were already, before his best work was made, woven into the fabric of what the 1950s meant. The decade's visual language ran through him. The early Universal films gave him little to work with dramatically. Criss Cross in 1949, a small role. City Across the River, the same year, slightly larger. The studio was not particularly interested in whether Tony Curtis could act, it was interested in whether Tony Curtis could sell tickets, and the answer to that question was arriving in the fan mail, which was substantial and predominantly female and made Universal's marketing department very attentive. He could act. This was becoming apparent in ways the Universal programmers were not quite designed to accommodate. Winchester 73 in 1950 gave him a brief but genuinely good scene with James Stewart Stewart, who was not a man who wasted his attention on actors who didn't merit it, treated Curtis as someone worth playing against rather than merely appearing alongside. The notice was minor. The signal was not. Houdini in 1953 was the first film that put Tony Curtis at the centre of something that actually used him, a biographical drama about Harry Houdini, the escape artist, in which Curtis played the lead with a physical commitment and an emotional intelligence that surprised critics who had filed him under pretty and moved on. The film was a commercial success. It demonstrated what the studio had not previously tested, that the face and the hair could carry a narrative as well as a frame. Janet Leigh was his co-star. They had married the year before, on the 4th of June 1951. She was 23. He was 25. They were the most photographed couple in Hollywood, two impossibly beautiful people whose wedding had generated coverage that most political events couldn't match. The marriage was genuine in ways that the coverage, which was primarily interested in the visual fact of them together, didn't have much room to explore. It was also, from early on, complicated by the specific pressures of two ambitious careers operating in close proximity in an industry that did not naturally support the equal advancement of both members of a couple. The hair was on the cover of every fan magazine in America. The face was on billboards across the country. Tony Curtis was becoming something that would outlast any individual film. He was becoming an image. The problem with becoming an image, as he would discover across the next 30 years, is that images are very difficult to grow inside. Chapter 3. The Peak. 1957 to 1960. 3 years. The years when Tony Curtis was the biggest movie star in the world, not the most respected, that was a different category, and the critics who had filed him under pretty had not entirely revised their assessment. But the biggest, the most watched, the most photographed, the most present in the global cultural conversation. In Britain, in Japan, in Italy, in South America, the face was recognizable in a way that preceded and survived any individual film. He was famous in the way that very few people are famous as a fact rather than as a consequence. Sweet Smell of Success came in 1957, and it remains, by any serious assessment, one of the finest American films. Curtis played Sidney Falco, a press agent, desperate and compromised and morally corroded by his own hunger for advancement, alongside Burt Lancaster's J.J. Hunsaker, a newspaper columnist modelled on Walter Winchell. All power and menace. The film was written by Clifford Odets and Ernest Lehman, directed by Alexander McKendrick, shot by James Wong Howe in a black-and-white New York that looked simultaneously real and operatic. Curtis was extraordinary in it. Sidney Falco is not a sympathetic character. He is a man who has decided that integrity is a luxury he can, and he performs the degradations his ambition requires with a specific self-hatred of someone who knows exactly what he is doing. Curtis played this without vanity, without the protections that movie stars of his standing typically maintained around their screen personas. He let Falco be ugly. He let the audience see the ugliness clearly. The film was not a commercial success on initial release. The studio didn't know how to sell it. It was too dark, too unresolved, too unwilling to offer the satisfactions that audiences in 1957 expected. It has grown in subsequent decades into something understood as essential. At the time, it demonstrated that Tony Curtis could act at a level his Universal programmers had never bothered to test. The Defiant Ones followed in 1958. Stanley Kramer's film about two escaped convicts, one white, one black, chained together and forced into proximity by circumstance. Curtis played John Joker Jackson alongside Sidney Poitier's Noah Cullen, and the film's moral argument about race, about America, about the specific way that prejudice damages the person who carries it as much as the person it is directed at, was delivered through two performances of genuine power. Curtis received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He did not win. The award went to David Niven for Separate Tables, but the nomination was not a consolation. It was a confirmation. The critics who had filed him under Pretty were in the process of revising their assessment, slowly, in the way that critical establishments revise assessments they had made too quickly without quite acknowledging the revision. And then Some Like It Hot, Billy Wilder, Marilyn Monroe, Jack Lemmon. 1959, the film is routinely cited as the greatest comedy in the history of American cinema, and the argument for that position is strong enough that most people who know the film don't bother disputing it. Curtis played Joe, a musician who disguises himself as a woman to escape the mob, assumes a second identity as a fake millionaire to pursue Monroe's sugar cane, and delivers in the process. A performance of precise comic timing and genuine romantic ease. The film made everyone in it more famous than they had been before it. It also produced the quote. The quote, "Kissing Marilyn Monroe was like kissing Hitler," attached itself to Tony Curtis and followed him for the rest of his life. It was reported widely, repeated endlessly, and used as evidence of various things about his character, depending on who was repeating it and why. Curtis's own account, given in multiple interviews over subsequent decades, was that the comment was taken out of context, that it referred specifically to the difficulty of filming a particular scene with Monroe, who required dozens of takes to deliver a line correctly, and who was, by every account, including Wilder's, extraordinarily difficult to work with on that production. Whether the full context changes the meaning is a matter of interpretation. What is documented is that Monroe was genuinely difficult on the Some Like It Hot set. Wilder confirmed this, Lemmon confirmed this, the production records confirm it, and that Curtis bore a significant portion of that difficulty in the scenes they shared. The quote ran. The film ran longer. Some Like It Hot was the highest-grossing film of 1959. Tony Curtis was 33 years old and at the absolute center of American popular culture. The Beatles were paying attention. 5 years later, when John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr sat down with Peter Blake to assemble the faces for the SGT. Pepper cover the people who had shaped them, moved them, mattered to them during their formation. Tony Curtis was on the list. His face appears in the upper section of the assembled crowd. This is documented fact. Curtis's face is on the SGT. Pepper cover. The Beatles chose it. No further justification was offered, and none was needed. He was, at his peak, that kind of famous. Chapter 4. The Marriages. Tony Curtis was married 6 times. This is the biographical fact that most accounts use as a punchline, and it is not a punchline. It is a pattern, and patterns have explanations. Janet Leigh was first. They married in June 1951, and the marriage lasted until 1962. By Hollywood standards of the period, this was a long marriage, 11 years, 2 daughters, the full performance of the glamorous couple that the fan magazines required and the studios encouraged. Their daughters were Kelly Curtis, born 1956, and Jamie Lee Curtis, born on the 22nd of November 1958. Jamie Lee Curtis became more famous than either of her parents. Halloween in 1978, Trading Places in 1983, A Fish Called Wanda in 1988, True Lies in 1994, a career built on intelligence and comic timing, and a refusal to be contained by the categories Hollywood offered her. Tony Curtis was proud of his daughter with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had spent his whole life performing Pride for the camera and found, in this one instance, that the performance and the feeling were the same thing. The Lee marriage ended because of the pressures that end most Hollywood marriages and some additional ones specific to this couple. Curtis's infidelities were documented. He did not deny them comprehensively, and a culture of Hollywood in the 1950s did not require denial as insistently as it would later. Leigh's own career was advancing with the independent momentum of a genuinely talented actress. Psycho came in 1960, and the shower scene made her more famous in a single afternoon than anything she had shared with Curtis had. The marriage became two separate careers sharing an address, and then it became a divorce. Christine Kaufmann was second. Austrian actress. 18 years old when they met on the set of Taras Bulba in 1961. Curtis was 36. They married in February 1963, 3 months after his divorce from Leigh was finalized. They had two daughters, Alexandra and Allegra. The marriage lasted until 1967. The age gap and the career asymmetry: he was a major star, she was a young actress navigating a film industry in a language that was not her first, made the marriage's difficulties structural as well as personal. Leslie Allen, Andrea Savio, Lisa Deutsch, Jill Vandenberg followed across the subsequent decades. Each marriage was covered by the press with decreasing interest as the star power that had made the first two marriages newsworthy contracted. Each ended. Each left its specific damage and its specific understanding. What the 6 marriages reveal, taken together, is not a man who was cavalier about commitment. Curtis described wanting to be married, wanting the stability of a household, with the genuine longing of someone who had grown up without it. They reveal a man who was very good at the beginning of things and constitutionally unable to maintain what the middle required. The childhood in the Bronx, the mother's illness, the brother's death, the emotional weather that required constant reading and constant adjustment had produced an adult who was extraordinarily skilled at charm and extraordinarily poor at the sustained vulnerability that long relationships demand. He knew this about himself. He said it, in various forms, across decades of interviews. Knowing it did not help him change it, which is the most human thing about Tony Curtis, and the thing the gossip columns, which preferred the punchline version, never found interesting enough to print. Chapter 5. The Drugs. The drug use began in the 1970s, and it nearly killed him twice. This is documented fact, not tabloid construction, and it requires the same directness as everything else in this story. The 1960s had not been kind to Tony Curtis in the way that decades are unkind to people whose peak coincides with a cultural moment that then moves on without them. The British invasion changed the American cultural conversation with the speed and totality of a weather event. The Beatles and the Stones and the Who, and everything that followed them, relocated the center of gravity in ways that made the Hollywood star system, with its manufactured glamour and its studio machinery, look suddenly like a relic. Curtis kept working. He made films throughout the 1960s that ranged from genuinely good The Boston Strangler in 1968, in which he played Albert DeSalvo with a psychological complexity that demonstrated again what he could do with real material, to commercial entertainments that paid well and asked little. The Standard was inconsistent in the way the Standard becomes inconsistent when an actor has lost the leverage that allows them to refuse what they should refuse. The cocaine arrived in the early 1970s. Curtis was open about this in his autobiography and in subsequent interviews, not with the performative confession of someone seeking sympathy, but with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of someone who has processed what happened and decided that honesty is the only position available to him at this late stage. He used heavily. The use affected his work, his relationships, his finances, his health. He got sober. Relapsed, got sober again. The pattern of addiction and recovery that he navigated across the 1970s and into the 1980s was not a straight line, and he did not describe it as one. What is documented is that he achieved sustained sobriety and maintained it through the final decades of his life, a fact that received significantly less coverage than the addiction had, in the way that recovery always receives less coverage than collapse. The heroin came later, and it was worse. Curtis described in American Prince a period of heroin use that he characterizes as the lowest point of his life, a period when the distance between the man on the HGT pepper cover and the man he had become was not something he could look at directly. He got through it. getting through it cost him things he named specifically and things he chose not to name. What the drug years reveal about Tony Curtis is not weakness. Weakness is the wrong word for something that complex, and it is also too simple. They reveal someone who had built an entire identity on a manufactured surface, who had been Bernie Schwartz from the Bronx underneath Tony Curtis, the movie star, for his entire adult life, and who found that, when the star power contracted and the industry moved on, the surface didn't provide enough structure to hold the weight of what was underneath it. The painting saved him. This is his own account, and the account of people close to him in the recovery period. He had always drawn. Sketching was a habit from the Bronx years, something his hands did when his mind was working through something else. In sobriety, he turned the habit into a practice, and the practice into a serious artistic pursuit. His paintings, bold, colourful, influenced by Matisse and Picasso and Chagall, not derivative of them, but genuinely in conversation with them, were exhibited in galleries from the 1980s onward and sold for significant prices. The art world received Tony Curtis the painter with the slightly surprised generosity it extends to celebrities who turn out to be genuinely capable, and Curtis accepted the surprise without particular rancor. He had spent his whole life being underestimated and had developed a specific relationship with it, not resignation, but the pragmatic patience of someone who has learned that the only response to being underestimated is to keep working until the evidence becomes unavoidable. Chapter 6. Hollywood's Forgetting. The forgetting happened in stages, which is how Hollywood's forgetting always happens. It is not a decision. It is an accumulation of smaller decisions, the role not offered, the call not returned, the name not on the list, that eventually amounts to the same thing as a decision without anyone having to make one. The early 1970s were the first stage. The studio system that had built Tony Curtis and understood how to use him had been dismantling itself since the mid-1960s, replaced by a new Hollywood that was younger, European-influenced, interested in anti-heroes and ambiguity, and a visual language that owed more to Godard than to the productions Curtis had been made in. The new Hollywood was not interested in what he represented. It was interested in what it was inventing. He was 45 in 1970, not old, not finished, but mispositioned a man whose peak had coincided with a cultural moment that had definitively closed, trying to find footing in a landscape that had reorganized itself around different coordinates. The television work came. Curtis was clear in interviews that he had mixed feelings about television, not because he considered it beneath him, but because the roles television offered in the 1970s asked nothing of him beyond the fact of his continued recognizability. And he was too serious about acting to be entirely comfortable being used as a reference to his own past. He did it anyway, because professionals work and because the income was real. The film roles that came through the 1970s and 1980s were inconsistent in the way that a career in managed decline is inconsistent, the occasional good part surrounded by work that existed primarily to fill time and generate a fee. He was professional in all of it. His work ethic, which had been forged in the Bronx and hardened in the Navy and sustained through the entire arc of his Hollywood career, did not falter. He showed up. He prepared. He delivered what the material permitted. The recognition that his best work deserved arrived late and partially. Sweet smell of success was rediscovered by critics in the 1980s and 1990s and is now routinely included in lists of the greatest American films, not as a curiosity or a period piece, but as a genuinely alive piece of cinema whose moral intelligence has not dated. The Defiant Ones retained its reputation. Some Like It Hot was, and remains, canon. These films were discussed at considerable length in critical writing of the period. Tony Curtis, their star, was discussed considerably less. The critical rehabilitation of the films did not automatically translate into a rehabilitation of the man who had made them, which is the specific injustice of Hollywood's forgetting the work survives in ways the person doesn't. And the people doing the critical reassessment often prefer to discuss the work as though it made itself. He gave interviews throughout this period that were candid to a degree that sometimes surprised journalists who had expected the standard celebrity deflection. He talked about the Bronx, about Helen Schwartz's mental illness, about Julius's death, about the marriages, about the drugs. He talked about the industry with the clear eyes of someone who had seen it from the inside at its most powerful and its most indifferent, and had decided that honesty was the only mode available to him at this stage. Some of the candour worked against him in the specific way that candour works against people in industries that prefer its simulation to its practice. He said things that were true and that various people would have preferred he didn't say, and the things he said were reported with the framing that publications chose to apply to them, which was not always the framing that served the full truth of what he meant. The Hitler quote kept appearing. Every decade, some publication ran it again, without the context Curtis had spent years trying to attach to it. He addressed it. The addressing generated new coverage of the quote. The new coverage required new addressing. The loop ran for the rest of his life. Chapter 7. The Last Acts. Tony Curtis married Jill Vandenberg in 1998. She was 26 years old. He was 72. They remained married until his death. The age gap generated coverage of the variety that age gaps between older men and younger women generate a mixture of prurence and mild disapproval dressed as concern. Curtis did not engage with the coverage in any sustained way. He was 72 years old and had been managing his public image since 1948 and had arrived at a position where the management required less energy than it once had, because the stakes were different now. The paintings were selling. He continued to produce them throughout the final decade of his life with the disciplined regularity of someone who has found, late, the thing that makes the rest of the day make sense. The gallery shows continued in Las Vegas, where he had relocated, and in European cities where his name retained a resonance that Hollywood had stopped being interested in maintaining. American Prince, his autobiography published in 2008, was the most honest thing he ever put into public record. It covered the Bronx in detail that was painful to read Helen Schwartz's illness, Julius's death, the poverty that was specific and cold and not romantic at all. It covered the marriages with the candour of a man who has accepted that the record is the record, and that softening it serves no one. It covered the drugs with the directness of someone in sustained recovery who has decided that shame is not a useful relationship to maintain with your own history. The book was reviewed respectfully and sold modestly. It deserved wider readership than it received, which is a sentence that could serve as an epitaph for several chapters of his career. He had a heart attack in 2010. He had been in declining health for several years, a combination of emphysema, accumulated cardiac damage, and the general structural costs of a body that had been put through what his had been put through across 83 years. He died on the 29th of September 2010 at his home in Henderson, Nevada. Jill was with him. He was 85 years old, not 52, not on a hotel kitchen floor, not in any of the dramatic circumstances that Hollywood endings are supposed to provide. He died at home in Nevada after a long life that had been more complicated and more interesting and more genuinely achieved than most of the coverage of his death acknowledged. The obituaries ran with the photographs from the peak years, the pompadour, the smile, the black and white studio shots that made him look like something carved rather than born. They mentioned Marilyn Monroe. They mentioned the quote. Several of them mentioned the Beatles. Most of them mentioned Some Like It Hot last, which got the order wrong. Some Like It Hot should have been mentioned first, and Sweet Smell of Success alongside it, and the Defiant Ones after that. And the Oscar nomination. And the serious dramatic range that the studio system had spent most of his career underusing, and the paintings, and the survival, the getting through things that should have finished him and didn't. Bernie Schwartz from the Bronx. Died in Henderson, Nevada, 85 years old. The hair was famous before the man was. The man was more interesting than the hair ever was. Hollywood, in the end, could only remember the hair. Chapter 8. What Remains. Here is what the record actually shows, when you clear away the quote and the marriages and the tabloid decades, and look at what Tony Curtis actually did. He came from nothing, not the softened nothing of biographical convention, from genuine poverty, genuine deprivation, a household shaped by mental illness and grief and the specific limitations of an immigrant family in Depression-era New York. He got himself out through will and a face and the discipline of someone who understands that talent is only the beginning. He built himself into one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, not through inheritance, not through connection, not through the institutional advantages that ease other people's paths, through the application of everything he had to the one thing he had identified as his. Bernie Schwartz, who could not afford to eat reliably in the Bronx, ended up on the SGT. Pepper cover. Elvis Presley copied his hair. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated him for Best Actor. He made films that matter. Sweet Smell of Success is not a period piece, it is a film about the relationship between power and complicity that becomes more relevant rather than less as the decades accumulate. The Defiant Ones addressed American racism with a directness that its era rarely managed. Some Like It Hot is simply the best comedy American cinema has produced, and Tony Curtis is genuinely good in it, which is something that the shadow of Monroe and a quote have combined to obscure. He survived things that should have finished him. The drug years were real and serious, and he came through them. The industry's forgetting was real and systematic, and he kept working through it. The marriages were real and multiple, and he did not pretend otherwise. He painted. This matters more than most accounts acknowledge, not because the paintings are the equal of the films, but because they reveal something about the man that the films, produced under industry conditions, couldn't fully show. The paintings are made by someone who sees colour with genuine pleasure, who engages with form as a problem he wants to solve rather than a convention he wants to reproduce. They are made by someone who kept being curious about making things long after he had any professional reason to be curious. He was honest. This is, in the world he inhabited, a more unusual quality than it sounds. He told the truth about the Bronx, about the marriages, about the drugs, about what Hollywood was and what it did to people, with the particular frankness of someone who has decided that managing a public image is less interesting than telling a true story. The world he came from, the immigrant Bronx of the 1930s, the Depression poverty, the street gangs and the settlement houses and the tenement apartments, produced very few people who ended up on the SGT. Pepper cover. It produced Tony Curtis because Tony Curtis decided it would, and then made the decision real through 4 decades of work that the industry he worked in never quite knew how to value accurately. Hollywood forgot him, the way it forgets everyone who isn't useful to it anymore. This is not a tragedy specific to Tony Curtis, it is the standard operating condition of the entertainment industry. And he understood it and said so. What is specific to Tony Curtis is that the forgetting got the story wrong. The story was never the hair, never the quote, never the marriages counted up as evidence of something. The story was Bernie Schwartz, who became Tony Curtis, who made films that will outlast every publication that ran the Hitler quote and every decade that decided he was yesterday's news. The films are still there. Sweet Smell of Success is still there. The SG Pepper cover is still there, with his face in the crowd of people the Beatles decided mattered. And somewhere in Memphis in 1953, a 19-year-old named Elvis Presley went home from the movies and stood in front of a mirror and tried to get his hair to do what he had just seen Tony Curtis's hair do. He got it. The world changed. Tony Curtis never got the credit. He didn't need the credit. He had already done the thing.